Have you ever wondered if all this hustle and bustle has any purpose? If the days we live, filled with repetitive tasks and immediate concerns, are nothing more than an endless cycle? And what if, in reality, we are trapped in a kind of hell? Not a religious hell, but the hell of the absurd. Camus, in his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, left us with a provocation. What happens when, upon examining life, we discover it has no intrinsic meaning? What do we do then? Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But what happens when the why disappears, when the world demands that we push boulders like Sisyphus, only to watch them roll back to the bottom of the mountain? In the 21st century, the boulders have changed. They're no longer the same ones Camus described. They're not just the routines or the struggle to survive, but also the pressure of building our lives from scratch in an increasingly fragmented world. Think about it. We live in a time where the excess of possibilities has become a trap. We are constantly bombarded by choices, expectations, demands, and distractions. We're told that we are solely responsible for giving meaning to our lives. But are we really? Or are we being swept away by forces beyond our control? Today, we reflect on Camus's words and ask ourselves, in his quest for answers to the absurd, did he inadvertently push us into a new kind of prison? A prison where the present feels suffocating and the future seems unattainable? Could his philosophy of the absurd, so often celebrated as liberating, have become the foundation of an even deeper kind of hell? In this video, we will dive into the philosophical universe of Albert Camus, exploring how his perspective has shaped the way we live and questioning whether there's a way out. Because in the end, the most urgent question isn't whether we're living in the absurd, but this: what do we do about it? Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, starts with a central question that resonates through our lives. In the face of an indifferent and meaningless universe, how do we continue to live? For him, Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to eternally push a boulder uphill only to see it roll back to the starting point, symbolizes the absurdity of human existence. Imagine the scene. Camus, at the height of his reflection, decides to change the narrative, embracing a philosophy no one expected. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. But is that really the case? Camus proposes that by accepting the absurd, by recognizing that life has no intrinsic meaning, we can find freedom. He rejects suicide, whether literal or metaphysical, as a response to existential emptiness. Instead, he advocates for a revolt against the absurd, an active acceptance of the human condition, and a search for meaning even in the absence of a universal purpose. Sisyphus doesn't need a happy ending because the very act of pushing the boulder becomes his reason for living. The idea is beautiful, but also unsettling. Can we truly find happiness solely in the struggle? When we look around, we see that the modern world seems to have turned this philosophy into a kind of daily mantra. We are encouraged to accept our boulder, to work, produce, survive. But have we found the freedom Camus promised? The boulders of today are not just life's challenges, but also the demands of consumer society, social media, and constant comparisons. The absurdity of the 20th century, which Camus analyzed so meticulously, has given way to a different kind of absurdity in the 21st century. A life of material excess, information overload, and emotional disconnection. This brings us to a critique that cannot be overlooked. Camus' vision, so impactful in his time, seems to have lost some of its direction over the years. What was born as a symbol of resistance now appears to have turned into a shadow of resignation. Many simply push their stones without even questioning why. What Camus viewed as a conscious choice has, for many, become an unconscious obligation. And there's an even more unsettling question. Is imagining Sisyphus happy enough? Sisyphus's happiness, according to Camus, is found in the moment of revolt, in the act of defying the absurd and continuing on. But what happens when that defiance becomes mere repetition, when revolt turns into routine? Can we still call him happy? At the end of The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus invites us to embrace the struggle without hope, but with dignity. Today, however, perhaps we need to revisit this proposal. Perhaps the myth of Sisyphus, which was once liberating, has become a new form of enslavement. Perhaps it's time to question whether rolling the stone is still the best we can hope for. We live in an era where the present is not only exalted, but also burdened with expectations. We are bombarded with the idea that the here and now is all that matters, that we must seize every moment, live intensely, and find meaning solely in what is immediate. Yet there is a paradox. This obsession with the present, far from liberating us, imprisons us. Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, warned us about the danger of seeking definitive answers to life's absurdity. But what we see today is not a search for answers. It's an escape, a complete surrender to the concrete, the tangible, the material. If in the 20th century Camus denounced the existential void of a world without transcendence, in the 21st century we face the crushing weight of a hyper-concrete world where even time seems to have been monetized. The present has been transformed into a commodity. We are encouraged to consume experiences, capture them in photos, and share them on social media. Carpe diem, they say, but the modern carpe diem has nothing to do with the contemplative spirit of the classics. Instead, it is an endless race to accumulate moments we can display as trophies. This creates a new form of absurdity. Life, which should be lived, becomes something to be produced. Every moment is filled with tasks, deadlines, commitments, and incessant notifications. There is no space for reflection, no room to look beyond the immediate. We are like Sisyphus, pushing our stones, not just our responsibilities but also our very lives, turned into commodities. This obsession with the present leads to exhaustion. In a world where everything is measurable, from productivity to happiness, the pressure to live fully becomes unbearable. People feel like failures if they aren't constantly making the most of every moment. But how can we savor something we barely have time to understand? By rejecting the future and ignoring the past, we've created a society that lives only for the now but doesn't know what to do with it. There's no room for dreams, for long-term planning, for connection to something greater. And without that, the present becomes oppressive. What should be liberating, the idea of living in the moment, turns into a burden. Camus's philosophy helps us understand this dilemma. In his work, he argues that accepting the absurd is the first step toward freedom. However, he also emphasizes the importance of finding purpose even in a world without inherent meaning. What we see today, though, is the opposite. The acceptance of absurdity has led to passivity, inertia, and the inability to imagine anything beyond the here and now. The present has become a prison because we refuse to look beyond it. We have abandoned the myths, the narratives that once connected us to something greater than ourselves. Without these gods to guide us, we are stuck in an endless cycle, pushing our boulders without knowing why. The question we must confront is simple yet profound. How can we reclaim meaning in a world that insists on its absence? Perhaps the answer lies in recovering what we've lost, not in the sense of returning to the past, but in rediscovering the narratives, myths, and stories that help us understand our journey. Because without them, the present will remain an unbearable weight, and our boulder will keep rolling down the hill, leaving us to wonder if we'll ever find a different path. Camus imagined Sisyphus happy. The strength of his philosophy of the absurd lay in transforming repetition into resistance, continuous effort into freedom, and the acceptance of emptiness into something profoundly human. Yet, looking at our time, it seems that vision has been distorted. Today, we do not push our boulders with the same awareness as Camus's Sisyphus. We push out of habit, out of exhaustion, because we no longer know how to do anything else. The 21st century has confronted us with a different kind of absurdity, one just as crushing. It is no longer merely the indifference of the universe that challenges us, but the complexity of a hyper-connected world overloaded with stimuli. We work incessantly, but not to defy the absurd. We work to meet external expectations, to build identities that please others more than they satisfy ourselves, to remain relevant in a system that drains our energy and gives very little in return. Camus saw revolt as a conscious choice, an act of courage against the absence of meaning. But for many of us, revolt has become an illusion, a distraction. We rebel on social media, buy products promising transformation, and dive into superficial practices that mask a deeper void. Everything seems like an attempt to simulate control over something that, deep down, we know eludes us. Contemporary life has become a dull repetition. What might once have been resistance to the absurd has turned into resignation before it. We accept work as inevitable, routine as necessary, and exhaustion as proof that we are doing enough. And yet, we feel increasingly detached from any real sense of meaning. What Camus proposed as an active choice, accepting the absurd and resisting it, now seems like a passive condition. The absurd is no longer something we confront. It is something that surrounds us, defines us, consumes us. Perhaps the greatest danger of our time is the lack of awareness of this new form of absurdity. Many of us don't realize we are pushing our stones. We don't see the repetition because it's masked by tasks, deadlines, notifications, and constant demands. The noise of everyday life prevents us from noticing the mountain we climb every day or the stone we carry. And at the end of each day, when the stone rolls back to the start, we convince ourselves that there is no choice but to begin all over again. But there is a choice. There always has been. Camus taught us that absurdity doesn't have to be accepted as a burden. It can be transformed into an act of creation. The challenge is not just to accept the void, but to fill it with something of our own, something that resists the forces trying to turn us into automatons. Now, more than ever, we need to imagine a new Sisyphus. Not one who is merely content to push his stone, but one who refuses to do so without purpose. Contemporary absurdity doesn't have to be the end of the line. It can be the starting point for a new way of living, one that reclaims a sense of community, creativity, and transcendence. Because deep down, what Camus showed us is that we don't have to accept the world as it is. We can create something new, even when everything around us seems to be falling apart. Myths have always been guides. They carried humanity's greatest questions, offering answers that could not be explained by reason but felt by the soul. Long before the words of Camus or Nietzsche, before scientific and philosophical revolutions, humans sought in myths a connection to something greater, something that could bring meaning to their existence amidst chaos. And today, where are our myths? What remains of them? We live in an era that has ridiculed myths, dismissing them as naive stories or unnecessary fictions. But what we often forget is that myths were never meant to explain the world literally. They are not instruction manuals, but emotional and spiritual maps that help us navigate uncertainty. When we abandon myths, we don't just lose beautiful stories, we lose our guiding towers, our lighthouses in the midst of the storm. Joseph Campbell, one of the greatest scholars of mythology, argued that their purpose is to connect us to the transcendent. Myths give us tools to face the monsters within us and around us. When Camus proposed the myth of Sisyphus as a model for the human condition, he was, in a sense, trying to reinvent this role. He wasn't seeking ancient gods or supernatural narratives, but creating a new kind of myth, one that looked at the absurd and declared, even so, it's worth it. But the myth of Sisyphus, which in its time was a response to emptiness, now seems insufficient. While Camus suggested we could find freedom in the act of pushing the rock, the modern world has turned this act into a mechanical routine, devoid of reflection, devoid of passion. What was meant to be a rebellion has become resignation, and perhaps now, more than ever, we need new myths, or at least new ways of seeing the old ones. The myth of Sisyphus showed us how to resist the absurd, but now we face a different challenge. It is no longer just the void that threatens us, but the overabundance of stimuli, the disconnection, the isolation. Our monsters are no longer merely existential. They are technological, social, cultural. We live surrounded by invisible forces that shape our thoughts, our actions, our beliefs, and we lack the myths to translate them, to decipher them. Perhaps it is time to revisit the old myths, not to seek ready-made answers, but to find new questions. What kind of story can help us face the challenges of our time? What narratives can reconnect us with something greater than the immediate, the material, the tangible? Because without these narratives, we remain alone with our stones, trying to make sense of them in a world that seems increasingly chaotic. Myths don't have to be stories of gods and heroes. They can be small fragments of beauty and hope that remind us there is something beyond the crushing present. They can be a poem, a painting, a deep conversation, a genuine human connection. They can be anything that pulls us out of the repetitive cycle of absurdity and makes us look toward the horizon. In the end, myths are not just stories we tell. They are stories that tell us. They shape us, guide us, inspire us. And if we are living in an absurd hell, perhaps it is because we have forgotten how to create these stories, how to believe in them. But there is still time. We can still gather around the fire and invent new myths to light up the darkness. Faced with all this, an inevitable question arises. Are we doomed to live in this absurd hell? The myth of Sisyphus, which once offered the promise of freedom by embracing the void, now seems to have turned into another form of prison. We keep pushing our stones not because we find purpose in it, but because we see no alternative. We work, consume, survive, and call it life. But can we imagine something different? Albert Camus gave us a clue, even if indirectly. He believed in rebellion against the absurd, in the human capacity to resist, to create, to transform. However, this rebellion cannot be mere disguised resignation. We cannot simply accept the world as it is, endlessly pushing stones in perpetual cycles. We must imagine, as Camus suggested, but imagine more than a happy Sisyphus. We must imagine a new way of existing. The first step to escaping this absurd hell is to reclaim what we've lost, a connection to something greater. This doesn't mean returning to ancient mythologies or transcendent structures that no longer make sense to us. It means creating our own myths, our own narratives, to help us navigate the chaos. These myths don't need to be grandiose. They can be small acts of resistance, fleeting moments of beauty and meaning that remind us we are still capable of dreaming. We also need to slow down. The modern world relentlessly pushes us forward, demanding productivity, efficiency, and perfection. But perhaps the greatest act of rebellion is to stop, to look at the stone we push every day and ask, why? We won't always have an answer, but the simple act of questioning is already a step toward freedom. Moreover, it is crucial for us to reconnect with one another. Absurdity can be a solitary experience, but the fight against it doesn't have to be. Camus taught us that even in emptiness, there is beauty. That beauty is found in art, in poetry, in the stories we share. And above all, it is found in human connections, in the ability to see others and to be seen. Can we escape the absurd hell? Yes, but only if we are willing to reinvent the way we live. This requires courage. It requires imagination. It demands the ability to look into the void and instead of resigning ourselves, choose to create something new. Because in the end, the meaning of life is not something we find, it's something we build. Camus said, "The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." Perhaps he was right, but this struggle doesn't have to be lonely, nor does it need to be resigned. We can carry our stones together, we can transform our exhaustion into creativity, our despair into action, our emptiness into beauty. And in doing so, we can prove that the absurd is not the end. It is only the beginning. What will you do with your stone? That is the question I leave for you. And who knows, as we seek an answer together, we may begin to build a new myth. A myth for times as uncertain as our own. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. It's a privilege to share these reflections with you, especially in times when thinking deeply about life feels like an act of resistance. This journey has been more than a philosophical analysis. It's been an attempt to reconnect with questions we often set aside amid the noise of daily life. What do we do with our stones? How do we find meaning in a world that so often feels empty? These are questions that can't be fully answered in a single video, but they can be explored together, step by step, conversation by conversation. I'd like to share something personal. There was a time in my life when pushing my stone felt unbearable. Every day felt the same as the one before, and I was lost. But it was in that monotony that I realized the struggle doesn't have to be mere repetition, it can be an act of creation. I began writing, sharing, talking, and it changed everything. Maybe you're pushing your stone right now, but I want you to know you're not alone. There's beauty even in the effort as long as we don't lose sight of what truly matters. If you enjoyed this video or if it resonated with you in any way, I invite you to join this community of thought explorers. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, what inspired you, or even what your stone is. Your voice matters here, and together we can create a space to question, reflect, and imagine. And if you're wondering what the next topic will be, all I can say is, get ready for something that will challenge your perspective even further. I won't reveal it just yet, but trust me, you won't want to miss it. Lastly, remember, life may be absurd, but it doesn't have to be empty. Let's keep pushing our stones with purpose, passion, and maybe even a smile. Thank you for being here.